All right, we start as we do most nights with our chief BC election correspondent, Bryn Weese, reporting tonight from beautiful downtown Vancouver. Bryn, what's up?
Well, David, as you mentioned earlier, we now have a new poll out for the Victoria Times columnist. This was done by Oracle Poll Research, and it shows we've got a real horse race on our hands. The NDP just 4 points ahead of the Liberals in this poll. The numbers break down this way, David. The NDP has 41% support amongst decided and leaning voters. The Liberals have 37% support. Greens have 12%, and the Conservatives have 10%. We've talked about those last two numbers before. They've really been unchanged through this campaign. This poll is showing the Liberals are up a couple points, and the NDP is down 1 point in this poll from what we've seen recently. And it's important to note here, David, this poll was done between May 5th and 7th. It was a telephone survey of 1,000 randomly selected people, and it's got a plus-minus rating of 3 points. So we're almost getting to the stage where we would call this a statistical tie, but of course this is the lowest number we've seen over the recent weeks. But still, we are talking about tightening polls here, David. That's no mystery. Everyone is fully aware that this race is getting tighter by the day. Earlier today, Adrian Dix told supporters and reporters that he knew this race was going to be close, even with margins as large as 20 points months ago. He never thought it would be that far with just a couple days to go before the election. Let's listen to Adrian Dix from earlier today.
I always said the campaign was going to close. People will remember the 2009 campaign. There was a poll at the beginning of the campaign showing the NDP 18 points back. It ended up being a 3.6% margin in 2009. The campaign was always going to close. I never thought the lead was as large as it was. But look, it's up to the voters, not all of this. People are voting now. And so the polls are not very relevant. What matters is people are voting significantly in advance polls, and their vote will be counted as long as they only vote for one person.
And we're also seeing a very energetic Christy Clark on the campaign trail, David, maybe explained by the fact that these polls are now showing a much tighter race. Last night in Surrey, Christy Clark talked about making a comeback and said that really her message was starting to resonate with British Columbia voters because they are so different from the NDP. Let's listen to Christy Clark from late last night.
On May 14th, we have the chance to choose a government that will pay off the debt in 15 years. So that our children can have the future that all those brave pioneers dreamed of for us and for them. That is what separates us from the NDP, is we want to leave a better future for our kids. And we know we need to make the right decisions today.
And David, I don't know about you, but I watched the Kentucky Derby last weekend and watched the late surging Orb come back to actually win it, even though she was running back in the middle of the pack throughout most of the race. So maybe we're seeing a bit of that here with the Liberals. They're taking lessons from the Kentucky Derby last weekend.
All right, Bryn Weese, we'll see you later at the bottom of the hour. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, let's get a little perspective on the polls, this new poll, with our pollster, David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data. And David, first of all, are you surprised to see that some pollster out there has the gap right now at 4 points?
It doesn't necessarily surprise me. I think we'll have to see another poll before we know this is a trend. We saw the Forum Research poll a few days ago that showed similar tight race. But one thing to keep in mind is that historically in British Columbia, as we get closer to Election Day, the election gets closer. Even in the blowout election in 2001, in which the BC Liberals swept almost all the seats, they still blew out the NDP, but the race got tighter as we got closer to Election Day. So this is not beyond the norm. This usually happens in British Columbia, and so I do expect it probably to get tighter, particularly since it's getting a little nastier. And I think the BC Liberals have been somewhat effective at, again, making that contrast between them and the BC Liberals, BC New Democrats, and that's why I think it's tightening up a bit.
Now, one thing that political journalists and pollsters have in the back of their heads this final weekend is the Alberta provincial election. And let's recall the circumstances there. There was an incumbent, the Progressive Conservatives. They were way behind in the polls right up to the last weekend. I think they were 10 points back and then somehow pulled out a majority government. In BC, we have an incumbent government way behind in the polls. What do you think the odds are that what happened last year in Alberta could happen again this year in BC?
Well, there's always the chance. I'll go out on a limb here and say there's always a chance that in the last moment a lot of voters can change their mind, but it very rarely happens, if that's what in fact happened in Alberta, which I think it did. Why I think British Columbia is unlikely to be like Alberta was, is because both the BC Liberals and the BC NDP are known quantities. People have voted for these two parties for the last decade. And in Alberta, Wild Rose was a brand new party, and so there was a little more volatility. And what happens, I think, from a voter's perspective is, fear and doubt are really important factors in elections, particularly when you're running against an incumbent government. And that incumbent's always going to try to instill some doubt in voters' minds about the alternative. And what happened in Alberta was they were very effective at building some doubt, and then you had all those candidates saying some somewhat ridiculous things in Alberta that got them in trouble, and so that doubt became a seed, it grew, and I think voters switched. In BC, Christy Clark's trying to do that, but there may not be enough time for them to turn this around over the course of the next 4 days.
And last thing, David, something we've touched on before that I think is worth going over again. For the BC Liberals, a 4-point gap, if that in fact is what it is not the same 4-point gap for parties in other jurisdictions, and that is because the BC Liberal vote is inefficient. Help us out with that.
That's right. Well, you only have to look back to, I think, the 1996 election, in which the BC Liberals actually won more votes than the BC NDP, but actually lost the election, and the BC New Democrats won a majority government. And so what we mean by inefficient vote is that traditionally the BC Liberals do very, very well in more rural ridings, in the interior part of the BC. They run up big, big majorities. And so it's almost like there's wasted votes out there, where in the closer ridings in and around Vancouver, they could lose some close seats to the NDP, who often have a better get out the vote machine. And so, even if it's tied, the BC Liberals could still lose the election significantly to the NDP. And so that's why it's not just enough to be close. They actually have to be either tied or somewhat ahead for them to really have a chance, the BC Liberals, to win the election. David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, thank you so much. Thanks, David. All right, well, let's see what Vancouver 24 Hours columnist Bill Tieleman thinks of all this. Bill is in Vancouver, and Bill, I want to get your opinions on the polls first, but I also want to I want you to explain to us a story that broke, this sort of mid-afternoon, that once again apparently suggests the Liberals, while in government, were campaigning, engaging in partisan work on the government dime, on the taxpayers' dime.
Yeah, this is a replay or a reprise of a story that broke earlier, and that's when we found out that the government resources and staff were being used during government office hours for highly partisan political things. And the NDP's now got emails showing that it happened again in 2011 when there was some key by-elections with some of Premier Christy Clark's key staff, again doing the wrong thing. So there just seems to be every day, David, it's wild out here. It's a Wild West battleground, and every day seems to be one more story coming out. I don't know what will happen tomorrow or the next day, but this one obviously, again, is a refresher course for some people who remember this story, and it was a big bang when it happened before. And when it happened before, this was a story that essentially, well, to a degree, cost Kim Hackstad her job as Premier Clark's Deputy Chief of Staff. That was part of the Ethnic Gate memo, et cetera, et cetera. But the point there was, again, doing work, partisan work, on the government dime. Exactly, and then of course yesterday we found out Kim Hackstad is working in Premier Clark's campaign. So I don't know. There's just, you never know what's going to happen out here. Let me ask you about that, because I thought about that, and there was a lot of New Democrats who were quite excited, if I'll put it that way, to find Kim Hackstad volunteering to working on Christy Clark's campaign. But I thought for a second, I said, wait a minute, there was a deputy chief of staff to a premier who had to resign over an ethical issue, took no severance pay, and she's working on a campaign. And yet, the guy running for premier was a premier's chief of staff, had to resign over an ethical issue, and he took his severance pay. I really don't see the upside to New Democrats reminding people about those comparisons. Well, I think since then, David, that first Adrian Dix accepted responsibility, but he's been elected twice by the people in his riding, and then as the leader of the New Democrats, and is the leader today. So I think it's a little bit further removed, 13 years removed from then. All right, fair enough on that one. Let me ask you about these polls. 4 points. Inevitably, people will talk about pollsters' methods, et cetera, but what's the mood in the NDP camp? Well, I was interested to hear your previous guest, David, talking about this. And I, of course, was the communication director in 1996 when Glenn Clark did win with a lower percentage of the vote than Gordon Campbell, who was then the opposition leader. And, David Coletto is right. Absolutely, the NDP has a more efficient vote. I don't want to see a tied vote or even less. I think, though, what's important to remember is in 2009, when Gordon Campbell fairly easily defeated Carol James, who was then the NDP leader, the vote was 46-42 Liberal NDP, a 4-point gap, and that meant a significant number of seats went to the Liberals more than the NDP. So if there's a 4-point gap for the NDP in their favor, they will have a very significant, certainly a very comfortable majority if that's the final number.
And yet, does the presence of the Greens and or the Conservatives, I suppose, slightly change that? In other words, could they sap some NDP vote, efficient though it is?
Well, in fact, the major difference with 09 is that the Conservatives ran 21 candidates as opposed to, say, 56 right now, and they still got 2% of the vote. And the Greens ran pretty close to a full slate, and they got about 7-8% of the vote. So I think the numbers, in fact, favor, again, the NDP on that one. If there's going to be some bleed off one way or the other, it favors the NDP more than it does the BC Liberals.
A weekend to go to see if you're going to paint the town orange. All right, Bill Tieleman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.